Beer, wine, cheese, yogurt, sauerkraut, and bread all have one thing in common. None of these would be possible without fermentation, which can be defined as the transformation of food by various bacteria, fungi, and the enzymes they produce. In this presentation, I'm going to explain part of the process and history of three kinds of fermentation: alcoholic, acetic acid, and lactic acid, and give a few examples of products that would not be possible without the utilization of fermentation. Alcohol is the product of fermentation that most people are probably familiar with. The fermentation consists of yeast reacting with sugars and producing ethanol and carbon dioxide. This is a natural process and can be traced back millions of years, which is around the time bees started to produce the first form of concentrated sugar on Earth. Under normal conditions, honey has a sugar concentration of roughly 80%, which is too high for fermentation to begin, but once diluted with water, the yeast will begin to convert that sugar into alcohol. These yeasts are single-celled fungi that can be found everywhere in nature, in the soil, in the air, on the skins of fruits, and even within the bodies of humans and animals. Not all yeasts act the same, but most contribute to the fermentation in some way. Eventually, humans found a way to harness this form of fermentation, and our long history with alcohol began. In China, there is evidence of human-made alcohol dating back over 9,000 years, and primitive beers were being brewed in Egypt and parts of Europe only a few thousand years later. Alcohol has been a major part of human culture throughout history, and it still is today. Thanks to advancements in chemistry and microbiology, the production of alcohol has become a major commercial industry, improving both the quality and availability. Acetic acid fermentation is a secondary process that occurs after alcoholic fermentation. Once oxygen is introduced to an alcoholic mixture containing acetic acid bacteria, the alcohol is converted into acetic acid, or better known as vinegar. The history of vinegar is nearly as long as alcohol's, due mostly to the difficulty ancient people had with creating anaerobic environments. So any alcohol that was not consumed in a timely way turned to vinegar and was repurposed for other needs. In a supermarket, you will see vinegars labeled white wine, red wine, rice wine, or apple cider, and that's because these originally came from their alcoholic counterparts. However, vinegars produced now are made quickly and their alcoholic stage is never consumed. Next, we have lactic acid fermentation. This form focuses on vegetables because they contain the bacteria necessary for fermentation to occur. The process begins with heterofermented bacteria, meaning it has a main product, lactic acid, but also creates significant amounts of secondary products such as carbon dioxide, alcohol, and acetic acid. As the fermentation progresses, the acids produced lower the pH, and homofermented bacteria, which can survive a more acidic environment, take over and produce only lactic acid. Foods fermented through this process have a rich cultural history. Before refrigeration or canning, fermentation was the primary form of food preservation due to lactic acid's ability to inhibit the growth of bacteria that would decompose or spoil the food. This form of fermentation was originally used out of necessity, but the food produced became much more than that. As cultures develop, traditions are born, and that's what many of these foods have become. In Germany, sauerkraut is much more than just fermented cabbage. Through many generations, it became a source of pride for Germans, and to the rest of the world, it identifies strongly with German culture. Much the same is true in Korea, where kimchi is eaten with nearly every meal. Now that I've explained some of the processes of fermentation, I'd like to go over a few examples of foods that wouldn't be possible without it. First off are hot sauces, which fall into one of two main categories: vinegar-based and non-vinegar-based. The key ingredient in a vinegar-based sauce like Tabasco or Frank's Red Hot is acetic acid, which is made through acetic acid fermentation. Non-vinegar-based sauces, like sriracha, are created through the lactic acid fermentation of the chili peppers themselves. Next up is bread. Any form of leavened bread relies on yeast to create carbon dioxide that lifts the dough and creates those bubbles you'll find on the inside. Because oxygen is always available, alcoholic fermentation never begins, rather the yeast remains in its growth phase. Finally, chocolate would not be possible without fermentation. After harvesting the cocoa beans, they ferment for about a week until their acetic acid content reaches a point that ultimately kills the bean, darkening the color and allowing the unique taste of chocolate to come through. In conclusion, fermentation is an ancient natural process still being utilized around the world in a number of ways. And maybe next time you drink a beer, or eat a sandwich, or have a piece of chocolate, you'll have a little better understanding of what made that possible.